Hey guys, I'm here with Dr. Milo Wolf as of yesterday. Um, Firstly, big fan of your content. You produce a lot of great, really practical training information that I think applies to everyone really, and I think it's going to be really useful for calisthenics athletes. So, would you mind just giving a quick background of your training and academic history?
100%, man. So first of all, thank you for having me, and I'm glad you find the content useful. As far as my training and academic history, I got into academia as I think most lifters do because they've been lifting, right? You don't get to sports science typically unless you have some sort of personal, practical interest in it. So I've been lifting since I was about 14. I'm 23 now, so I've been lifting for about a decade. I have competed in both natural bodybuilding and in powerlifting, both to a decent level, but nothing crazy. So that's kind of where my interest in sports science stemmed from. Is I started lifting when I was 14, gradually got into the science side of it. I remember reading things like string theory or strong by science, as it is now known. I remember watching people like Omar Isuf, where, for example, I remember him bringing on Brad Schoenfeld, who I now actually work with, which is nice. Um, but yeah, that's kind of how my interest in lifting and the science behind it came to be. And then when I was 17 and I had to decide what I wanted to do for further education, I went for sports science, did my undergrad, and as of yesterday, finished my PhD. So that's kind of how that happened to come about. Um, I would say generally my main interests nowadays are muscle hypertrophy and muscle strength. I think I'm reasonably well educated in both, and so I hope my advice is pretty solid. But that's kind of my background as far as lifting goes.
Great. Yeah, and it's great that you are a lifter yourself because there's a lot of people online who say, "Oh, those scientists, what do they know? They're just in a lab." But you've got the practical experience as well, both from a hypertrophy bodybuilding and a strength powerlifting perspective. And your PhD thesis was in the topic of range of motion and hypertrophy. Is that correct?
That's completely correct. My topic was the effects of range of motion during resistance training on muscle growth and muscle strength, essentially. So how does your range of motion when you do, for example, a pull up or a push up or a dip or any sort of movement really translate into how much muscle growth you see and how much strength improvement you see?
Great. Can you give us a lay of the land on how range of motion affects training? Because I believe there's quite a bit of nuance around partial reps. You know, it's no longer this age-old saying of like partial reps aren't as good as full reps.
Yeah, there's no longer like back in the day it was part of gym fails. If you saw someone do partial reps, it could be on Gym Fail Nation or other such Instagram pages. It's funny because actually yesterday during the transfer, I had some examiners, and one of them was a relatively old school sports scientist, and he was very skeptical of the notion of partial reps. So even within literature, even within sports science, some people are still a bit skeptical. So basically, here's the lay of the land as it comes to range of motion. As of a few years ago, our best understanding, as summarized in a systematic review by Brad Schoenfeld and Gurgic in 2020, was that full range of motion was best for hypertrophy. We thought that for both the lower body, especially lower body, we had most studies were in the lower body. We had 6 studies, 4 of them were in the lower body, and 2 of them were in the upper body. But by and large, across those 6 studies, full range of motion tended to be best. That said, in the upper body, it was a bit less clear, and so that left some confusion on the table as far as exactly what the relationship between range of motion and hypertrophy really was. Now, the reason why there was some confusion with the upper body is because one study had actually found better hypertrophy using partials versus a full range of motion. And a few years later, when it came time for me to do my systematic review as part of my PhD, basically what turned out to be the case is that the reason that study likely found better hypertrophy doing partials is because in that study, partials were actually performed at relatively longer muscle lengths. So when the muscle groups being trained were being stretched out a lot. So in this case, they were doing skull crushers and they were doing kind of not quite the bottom half, but more so the bottom half versus when you do a full rep. And so on average, the triceps are being trained at longer muscle lengths. And indeed, if you look at the overall evidence, when you simply compare full range of motion to partial range of motion, you see that full range of motion leads to more growth. But you're missing a lot of detail there because it seems to be that the muscle length at which you perform those partial reps really does matter. So when you compare partial repetitions, so not doing the full rep at longer muscle lengths versus full range of motion, actually, we have 5 studies now. In 4 of those, we see a hypertrophy benefit to doing partials at lower muscle lengths. And one study found no difference. So it seems very promising that doing partial range of motion repetitions at longer muscle lengths leads to more hypertrophy versus doing just full range of motion. The same principle applies across a wide variety of contexts. So I'm pretty confident in saying this is likely going to be the case. Yes, you could absolutely say, look, we only have 5 studies, but equally, when you have several areas of evidence that all lend credence to the overall principle of, look, longer muscle length training really seems to be better than shorter muscle length training. This is true across, in total, about 30 studies. So we have about 5 studies comparing isometric holds at different muscle lengths, longer versus shorter. And generally, consistently, longer muscle length isometrics are better. We have about 9 studies comparing partial reps at different muscle lengths. So doing partials, for example, at the top for a curl at short muscle lengths versus at the bottom, where your biceps are really stretched out. And again, across those 9 studies, very consistently, partials at longer lengths are better than partials at shorter lengths. Same thing for full range of motion versus shortened partials. Well, on average, with a full range of motion, you'll be at longer muscle lengths. Consistently, that's why you saw in that early systematic review, because again, with full range of motion, you're at longer muscle lengths. So even though we only have 5 studies now comparing longer muscle length partials or lengthened partials to a full range of motion approach, the findings within those 5 studies are very consistent. As I said, 4 show benefit to lengthened partials. And if you zoom out and look at the overall principle, it becomes very self-evident. Are there still some questions that need to be answered regarding mechanisms, regarding potentially whether it applies to all muscle groups or not? Absolutely. But for the time being, it seems pretty clear that for hypertrophy, it's a relatively clear-cut picture. For performance specifically, real quick, it seems as though there's 2 main findings. One, the most robust one we have, is will give you performance benefits or strength benefits in pretty much every range of motion. So if you do a full range of motion, you'll still get strong in a partial range of motion, right? So you can still do heavy partials even if you just train full range of motion and be pretty strong there. The transfer from partial range of motion over to full range of motion, if you only do partial range of motion, right? Let's say only half squat, for example. How well you're going to perform in an ass to grass squat is not clear. And in fact, you probably do worse. So there's better transfer from full range of motion over to partial range of motion than from partial range of motion over to full range of motion, which makes sense because when you do full range of motion, you include every range of motion. So you're kind of prepared for everything. Whereas if you do partial range of motion, you're not prepared at all for the parts of the range of motion that are included in full range of motion, but not in the partial. So that's one thing. The second, performance adaptations seem to be quite specific. So if you want to get better at a certain range of motion, you really want to be performing it. That's how you'll see your best gains. So for powerlifter, squat to powerlifting depth. For powerlifter, also bench to, don't try and get excessive range of motion if you're usually benching with an arch. So it really is specific. You really want to train the range of motion you want to get better at. And the final thing is there's some emerging evidence that combining mostly specific range of motion, so for example, for the powerlifter, that could be mostly squatting to parallel, but adding in some partials might actually lead to slightly better strength gains. There's about 4 or 5 studies looking at the combination of full range of motion and partial range of motion and seeing how that influences strength gains. So potentially adding in some partials in your training, definitely not the bulk of your training, right? The bulk of your training should still be specific, but some partials might actually make for better strength gains.
That's a pretty clear picture. Thanks for that. I think that's really relevant to a calisthenics skill, which is the handstand push-up. So if you think of a handstand push-up as kind of like an overhead press, but most people do it on the ground, it's like a very shortened partial. And I'm aware of the studies looking at, adding heavy partial squats to lighter full squats. You see kind of a neutral to a positive effect there. And I assume that's very transferable to the handstand push-up because to maximize strength, you really want to be training in that range and training at a high intensity, but you're probably leaving some hypertrophy gains on the table by only training in this shortened position. And do you expect most of those benefits that come from adding that kind of full range of motion in or adding the lengthened component come from just stacking on more muscle growth?
Yes. So I think as far as strength goes, that is going to be part of it. And so if you don't have a clear weakness, let's say, for example, you're doing a handstand push-up and you find that there's a certain part of the range of motion that you really struggle in, unless you have a clear weakness, I would say doing a lengthened partial, if you're trying to add in some partials for better overall strength development, that's probably your best bet. Because ultimately, in the long term, past about 6 to 12 months of lifting, when you first start lifting and it's mostly about technique development, neuromuscular adaptations, and that sort of stuff, past that point, muscle mass improvement is really the name of the game. So if you can use a strategy to make you gain more muscle, that is going to lead to better strength gains long term.
Great. I'm really glad you said that because I think hypertrophy is often a kind of forgotten component, especially with like newer powerlifters and with calisthenics athletes as well. Because strength and hypertrophy are correlated, seem to be better correlated in more trained lifters, but it's not a perfect correlation. And I think that leads to some people kind of erroneously interpreting that as it doesn't matter.
For
But
sure.
it
And I think
definitely
with
does.
with hypertrophy as well, you have the delayed gratification. You know, technique is the sexy thing where, you know, you can always go on Instagram and see a new cue that you can use and maybe it'll work or maybe it won't. But with hypertrophy, building meaningful size will take time. And so even though it's likely the right answer, it's also the boring answer and people won't like it.
Yep. Yeah, unfortunately, it's not as appealing on social media. When you compare lengthened partials to full reps, and if we're just purely talking about muscle growth and hypertrophy now, do you have some thoughts on why that seems to yield better results in the research?
Yeah, so it's funny because I was discussing that very topic with my examiners yesterday for my PhD. Um, the long story short is, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of clarity right now. There's a few potential mechanisms, and I'll mention them now in not too much depth, so as not to get bogged down in detail. There's a few things. One thing we consistently see in the evidence is that the distal areas of a muscle group, let's say, for example, you're training your biceps, right? You can kind of break down your biceps into different regions. Yes, it's one muscle group, but you can talk about more proximal regions, which is closer to its origin point, which basically just means where does it insert that's closer to the midpoint of your body around your navel. For the biceps, that happens to be closer to the shoulder. And closer to the origin point is what we call proximal areas or proximal regions. Then conversely, you have distal regions, which is essentially closer to the further apart or farther from the center point of the body insertion site. So we have proximal areas and we have distal areas. It seems as though longer muscle length training, for example, lengthened partials versus full range of motion, preferentially leads to more growth in the distal areas of a muscle group. So for the biceps, that would be closer to the elbow. For the quadriceps, for example, that would be closer to the knee. So it seems as though that's the case. And so when we're talking about differences in hypertrophy, it could be that these small differences in, for example, activation in those areas could be leading to differential hypertrophy more so regionally than necessarily across the whole muscle, right? That is one possibility. Whereas if you look at more proximal sites, like closer to the shoulder for the biceps, it seems like over there, typically, there's much less of an effect. There might still be an effect every now and then, but the effect is much lesser. And so it could just be that longer muscle length training simply recruits and activates those distal areas of your muscle groups a bit more effectively, thus leading to more hypertrophy in those areas. That's one possibility. Another possibility is related to passive tension. So the main, most substantiated mechanism for inducing muscle hypertrophy that we currently have is tension. Basically, you expose your muscles to tension, whether that's active tension, which is when your muscles contract, for example, against a weight or against your own body weight in order to lift, for example, during a push-up or during a bench press, in order to lift that load. And there's passive tension. Passive tension, you can kind of conceptualize as your muscles and your tendons and your connective tissue being kind of like a rubber band. When you take both ends and you stretch them apart, there's some tension being built up to return that muscle tendon unit to its original length. So as you stretch it out and stretch it out to longer and longer muscle lengths, that's building up passive tension. And as I just mentioned, tension leads to growth. And so when we're shifting your training to being at longer muscle lengths, so on average, your muscles being stretched out more like a rubber band, we're seeing more tension build up. So it could be, number one, that it's the passive tension itself, and indeed passive tension and active tension seem to lead to hypertrophy a bit differently. And so maybe using both and getting a good deal of both is best, which you could achieve via, for example, length and resistance training, lengthened partials, for example, or it could be just the overall tension. So you can get similar levels of active tension for the most part between somewhat shorter muscle length training and somewhat longer muscle length training. But with longer muscle length training, you have the added benefit of that passive tension, which then leads to more overall tension, which, as I mentioned, tension is the most substantiated mechanism for muscle hypertrophy. Those are, I would say, the two main mechanisms or hypotheses I put forth. The final one could be related to signaling proteins. So certain proteins that signal for a pathway involved in muscle growth called mTOR are potentially length dependent as well. So they get activated when tension is applied, but they may get activated even more when tension is applied and your muscle is at a certain length, and in this case, at a long length. And so it could be just more hypertrophy signaling occurs when you're both exposed to tension and at a long muscle length. So by and large, those three are the main mechanisms at present. Like those are the ones I spoke about in the thesis, for example. Those are the ones I think have the most credence.
Great. And I think a really simple way to think about it conceptually is just given that when you compare lengthened partials to full range reps, you seem to get, at worst, the same result, and at best, better hypertrophy with lengthened partials. It's probably just that you're leaving out the kind of least stimulating part of the lift, and you can spend more of your energy in that kind of zone that's more stimulative for muscle growth.
100%. I think there's kind of two tiers of mechanisms here. The first tier that you just mentioned is kind of how it's mediated, right? And then there's a set of mechanisms molecularly. But how it's mediated, as you mentioned, seems to be that it's kind of like, let's say you really like Coke or Pepsi, right? You really like it, and it's what really gets you going. So you might think, well, I'm going to just drink that. And someone might tell you, well, maybe you should water it down with water and drink that instead. And you're like, but it doesn't taste as good. And that's kind of how longer muscle length training and shorter muscle length training might intertwine. Where if you do a full rep, yeah, you get Coke, aka longer muscle length training, but you also have to cut it down with water because you do a full range of motion. Whereas if you just do lengthened partials, you get to drink pure Coke, for example.
Yeah,
so
great analogy.
That's basically how I'd see it.
Awesome. And I think everybody agrees that mechanical tension is the primary thing that stimulates muscle growth. But it's a bit controversial. Some people kind of live in this camp of only tension matters. And then I think the real experts in the field think there might be some other contributing factors. Do you have any thoughts on that?
For sure. So I will say, for the time being, tension is the mechanism we have the most evidence for, right? The other things are a bit more difficult to measure, especially in humans, right? However, there are at least one other mechanism and one mechanism that's less likely, but potentially contributing as well. One mechanism that's very likely playing a role is metabolite presence within the muscle. So we do have evidence both in individual muscle fibers, in animal models, that, for example, lactate presence within the muscle can directly contribute stimulate hypertrophy independently of any tension being applied. And so it's unclear to what extent it's going to contribute metabolite accumulation as a whole to hypertrophy, but there is pretty compelling evidence at this point that it plays a role. If I had to put a number on it, it might be something about like 10% of the hypertrophy effect, 20%. It's a very imprecise estimation at this stage. So definitely there's an effect there. Secondly, and this is a bit more tenuous, is muscle damage. So this is actually all beautifully illustrated, by the way, in a paper entitled Stimuli and Sensors of Skeletal Muscle Hypertrophy. I believe that's what it's called. And you can kind of read through that paper. Yes, correct, yeah. And you can read through that paper and get an idea of what the sort of lay of the land is for mechanisms. But with muscle damage, it's a bit less clear. It seems to be that there can be an interference effect, where if muscle damage is too high, and this was illustrated by a paper a few years ago by Damas and colleagues, if muscle damage is too high, you train too hard, accumulate too much muscle damage, that can interfere with muscle growth. So definitely if you get too much muscle damage, not a good thing. Equally, there are some lines of reasoning that some muscle damage might be a good thing for hypertrophy. At the very least, it seems to correlate to an extent with hypertrophy. So if you don't see any muscle damage, there's a chance that you might not see much growth. As far as whether or not it directly causes growth, that's a bit less clear.
Yeah.
There's some reasoning, for example, that because non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, so NSAIDs, inhibit hypertrophy if you take them after a session, for example, because those can kind of counteract some of the muscle damage pathways, and they also seem to counteract hypertrophy. Some people think that maybe muscle damage is playing a role for hypertrophy. So muscle damage is probably the weakest one for the time being. Metabolites are definitely notable at this stage. I would say they're very likely playing a role, but I would say tension is the main thing. And that's kind of how I would see the mechanisms involved for hypertrophy.
Yeah, I think it's pretty hard to tease apart muscle damage and tension, because it's very unlikely that you can apply tension or significant tension to a muscle without getting damage as kind of like an epiphenomenon.
100%.
But yeah, I'm glad you talked about cleared things up about the metabolites, because I think a lot of people neglect that. It's likely not the primary thing stimulating muscle growth, but yeah, it seems to be relevant.
100%. And with all these things, it's very difficult to get at a clear answer experimentally because you have to design studies in a certain way. You know, it's difficult to separate tension from muscle damage, like you mentioned. The same thing applies, for example, to determining whether an increase in muscle size directly causes an increase in muscle strength. So there's actually a camp of researchers. I get where they're coming from. It's kind of like a devil's advocate situation, but there's a camp of researchers, for example, that argue that we don't have any evidence suggesting, or more so, strongly suggesting that an increase in muscle size, so muscle hypertrophy, will then directly cause an increase in muscle strength. And the reason for that is whenever we induce an increase in muscle size, guess how we do it? We lift. And
Yeah.
when we lift, we could just say, well, you lifted, so you got stronger. It's not the muscle growth you got from that. So it can be quite difficult to strongly prove via research.
Yeah, I think there you can be just on more solid footing using mechanistic arguments. Like all else being equal, there are many things that contribute to strength that we have no control over. But all else being equal, a bigger muscle with more contractile proteins should produce more force than a smaller muscle.
100%. And when all else fails, I just take off the shirt, flex on them, and we
That's
call
the
it
way
a
to
day.
do it.
You know? Hey, here's your citation, you nerd, you know?
Perfect. Could we talk a little bit about training volume and how this affects adaptations? So firstly, how would you measure training volume? I know there's plenty of ways to measure it. And how does training volume affect your training outcomes with regards to strength and hypertrophy?
So training volume in sports science has traditionally been defined as workload. So essentially just think back to physics, force times distance, for example, right? Now, over time with lifting research, that became defined more so as sets times reps times weight, sometimes times range of motion as well, to kind of get a rough measure of how much work was performed during a whole session, right? And that was then quantified as volume. And back then was more so referred to as volume load, for example. Now, with regards to hypertrophy, a lot of recent review papers have pushed for the adoption more so of a volume definition based on number of hard sets per muscle group per week. And this makes a lot of sense because independent of what exercise you do, what rep range you do for the most part, a variety of rest time, etc. For the most part, what seems to be strongly predictive of hypertrophy is number of hard sets. Let me tell you why volume load wouldn't be the right way to look at it. If you chose to look at volume as sets times reps times weight, you might say that doing a set of 20 reps on leg press is far superior to a set of 6 reps on, say, a squat. Because when you do a set of 6 on squat, you might get a volume load of, say, 1 set times 6 reps times, say, 100 kilograms. That's 600 units, right? On the leg press with 20 reps, you could comfortably get 150, and that would be 3,000 units. Now, does that mean the set of leg press is 5 times as effective as a set of squats for hypertrophy? No, and it turns out via the research, they're about equally effective. And so there's a lot of pitfalls to using volume load as your metric for sort of quantification of volume. And so number of hard weekly sets, and that's sets relatively close to failure, seems to be a much better metric for volume. Sorry, what was your second question about volume?
How does volume affect my training adaptations? Should I be doing,
Sure.
Is there a perfect number of sets, or could you give me a rough estimate of how many sets I should be doing to maximize strength and hypertrophy?
That's a good question. Now, I think that a good starting place is there is a dose response relationship between volume and hypertrophy, which means the more volume you do, so number of hard sets per week per muscle group, the more hypertrophy you see until a certain point. Now, where that point is at present, unfortunately, isn't all that clear yet. You know, we have about 6 studies now looking at very high volumes, and I'm talking over 25 sets per week per muscle group. And in those studies, it seems to be that about half of those studies, you see no difference between, say, doing 10 to 15 sets and about 25 or more sets. And then in the other half, you do actually see a benefit to doing more than 25 sets. Importantly, in these studies, they're often training only one muscle group. And so you probably couldn't do 30 sets for each muscle group every week and still benefit. Or maybe you could, but you just don't know yet. Equally, in these studies, oftentimes they're resting for a minute or two between sets. If you rest for longer than this, you might need to adjust these numbers downwards. And finally, in these studies, once again, they are counting volume towards all muscle groups at once. So if you're doing a push-up, for example, that would count as one set towards your triceps, towards your front delts, towards the serratus anterior, towards your chest. So it would be a lot of volume all across the board. So just make sure that when you're looking at these figures, you keep that in mind. As far as what the optimal number for hypertrophy is, in my estimation, for anyone who's been training for at least a few months now, it's going to be somewhere between about 15 sets a week and maybe around 25, maybe up to 30 sets a week. Now, that's a pretty wide range. But keep in mind, in the evidence, they've actually studied volumes of up to 40 or more sets a week. But for the time being, I think that's our best bet, given that we only have a few studies in that sort of realm of volume. I think 15 to 25 sets is a really good starting point.
And just to clarify, that's per muscle group, not overall training sets.
Oh, if that was overall, you'd be in the gym for 10 minutes total. That'd be insane.
Yeah. And how about strength? Do you think it's different for strength?
Yes, I do think it's different for strength, and we do have data to support this. Generally, strength benefits from slightly lower volumes. So if your ideal volume for hypertrophy seems to be about 15 to 25 sets per week per muscle group, your ideal volume for strength might be closer to about 10 to 20 sets. Now, because strength is also specific, you will want to get most of that volume in via the movement you're trying to get better in. It is partly skill acquisition, pennation angle changes, all sorts of other specific adaptations. But generally, that is the case, and that's what's been reflected, for example, in a meta-analysis by Ralston and colleagues back in 2017. That's it.
So then let's say you're a power builder or you're somebody who has simultaneous strength and hypertrophy goals. How would you apportion your training volume? Let's say for your pecs, let's say you're trying to improve your bench. Would you try to go for those, 10 kind of heavy sets and make those highly specific, and then get to the higher end? Let's say you tolerate high training volumes well. Try to push that out to 30 with accessories and other exercises? Or would you try and keep it, a little bit lower, somewhere in the middle?
So I would say a few things. One, generally, if you're trying to max out soon, for example, or you're trying to compete in powerlifting, like obviously power building means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. For some people, it actually means competing or maxing out every now and then. For some people, it's just developing general strength while also mostly focusing on hypertrophy. So if you're going to compete soon, generally specificity should increase more and more as you get closer to competition or closer to a max out. So in the off season, don't be afraid of making most of your training pretty hypertrophy specific. And that will include relatively higher volumes, for example, and not as much heavy work, not as much of the main movement that you're trying to focus on. And then as you get closer to competition, generally most of your work should come from the main lift that you're trying to focus on, or main lifts, mostly in those low rep ranges that are specific to your competition and so forth. Now, as far as volumes would go, sort of on an average level, if you're not going to max out, I would say you're better off being in those sort of hypertrophy rep ranges. I think getting maybe about a quarter to half of your volume from those strength patterns, unless you're very close to competition, is a pretty good amount. I think that will give you a pretty good bang for your buck as far as still getting strength adaptations and improvements in your technique and so forth, but still have enough of your volume left over to focus on potentially more hypertrophy focused or optimal movements, right? Because if you're doing, for example, a deadlift without an eccentric, that may not be ideal for muscle growth. And so if you did all your volume on that movement, that wouldn't be ideal. But doing perhaps 25% to 50% of your volume on those main lifts or close accessories, that would be ideal. And then the rest of your volume, potentially if you're saying, say, doing 20 sets a week per muscle group, in that case, potentially doing about 10 to 15 of those sets as more hypertrophy focused movements. Now, different movement patterns potentially benefit from different volumes. It seems to be the case that most people, and I'm going to talk about sort of broad movement patterns here instead of powerlifting, it seems that most people seem to be able to handle higher pressing volumes, for example, benching, dips, push-ups, overhead push-ups, than they can, for example, hamstring or glute volume. Generally, it seems to be the case that most people can handle a little bit less squatting or lunging type volume than they can handle pressing volume. I think pulling volume is like, for example, pull-ups, rows, etc., generally seems to be about the same as pressing or actually slightly above. So maybe closer to 20, 25 sets a week, pretty comfortably. And then finally, as far as deadlifting volume, so sort of hamstrings, glutes, and those areas, they seem to benefit from even higher, lower volumes typically than squatting type movements. So maybe closer to about 15 sets a week per muscle group.
This is an area of research where I feel that the academic picture and the practical picture kind of diverge. Because if you talk to people in the kind of evidence-based community, you often get this recommendation of 15 to 30 hard sets per week should be good for most trained lifters. But when you look at bodybuilders and even natural bodybuilders, and they're like, dude, I do that in a session. That's my chest, that's my chest day, and I'm doing that twice a week. Where do you think that that disconnect is? Or do you think it is a big disconnect, just given the uncertainty about where that upper end of kind of optimal is for training volume?
For sure. I think there's a few things here. Number one, I've been increasingly forced to rethink how much we can do and benefit from. If you look at the recent data on training to failure, for example, you see that even taking sets all the way to failure on a per set basis, if you compare just one set not to failure versus one set to failure, does lead to more hypertrophy and relatively substantially more hypertrophy. Now, if you're coming from a background of never training to failure, and because you think, oh, it's too fatiguing or it's not actually benefiting you, that's probably going to cause you to rethink some stuff. The same applies for volume, though, it seems, where simply training more, and in these studies, yes, they're training just one muscle group with low rest times and so forth. They're doing all of their sets to failure typically, and they're doing 20 to 50 sets a week per muscle group, and they're benefiting from it versus, say, doing fewer sets. And so, when you then, in light of these sort of findings, interpret some of the old school bodybuilders' training splits, where they were doing across the week often 30, 40 sets a week per muscle group. And yeah, sure, if you actually look at their training, a lot of them weren't training to failure. A lot of them were sort of like not chasing the pump, but if you look at, for example, Ronnie Coleman's training, like he had his heavy sets for sure, but a lot of them were also not like, he didn't fail reps a lot, but they were still training pretty hard, but they were getting in 30, 40 sets a week. And seemingly, I mean, if you're going to take the anecdote route, they were doing pretty okay, So it could be the case that because some researchers and some influencers nowadays are seeing these results of, for example, this recent study, right, in the quads, where the highest volume group, they were doing 37 sets of quads a week on average, pretty close to failure across 2 sessions. And yes, they were only training the quads. But some people will look at these findings and be like, that's ludicrous. No one could survive that session. It's impossible. But then you look at what other people have been doing for decades, and you see that they did this, and that they, in fact, seemingly didn't get held back from it very much at all. And so maybe, and this is kind of an appealing notion if you're someone who's kind of wanted to be like, man, I wish I could quit my job and just train all day. If you're that guy, the notion that you could simply train with higher volumes, closer to failure, and see more growth is actually pretty exciting.
Yeah.
So that's what I would say to anyone who's like, oh, these studies couldn't have been done, or I couldn't recover from that much volume. There's plenty of studies where they do this much volume and see a benefit from it. So maybe try training a little bit harder than you usually do.
Yeah, I think with calisthenics, it's generally the opposite type of person where they're like 30 sets per week. I'll do that in a day. And just anecdotally, I think a lot of the listeners will know about this guy. There's a guy named Andrew Strong. He's a phenomenal calisthenics athlete, unbelievably strong. He does handstand push-ups with 40 kilograms attached. And I asked him, I said, what's your training like? How many sets of pushing do you do a week, of planche and handstand push-ups? And he said, I do about 5 exercises and about 5 sets of each exercise for pushing every day. And I was like, you mean 7 days a week? And he's like, yeah. And I thought, okay, that's fine. Maybe these are like, RP6, maybe they're a lot of reps in reserve and it's, really technical. And I said, are you going close to failure? And he said, yeah, I either fail or I'm, really grinding that last rep. And I was like, that's over 120 sets of pushing, 2 or close to failure every week. And you are, arguably the strongest pushing guy in calisthenics. And he's like, yeah. And when I, when I have a lot of time to dedicate to training, I sometimes do 2 sessions a day. So it's, it's more like 200 sets a week. And I know you cannot generalize that. And this is a freak of nature, and you can't compare the counterfactual of maybe he'd be stronger if he did fewer sets. But I think it paints the picture of, for a lot of people, you can handle more training volume than you think you can. Your body can adapt to training to failure. And one thing I've seen is that a lot of really advanced athletes, they put in a lot of work. It's a lot more than you kind of see in the literature.
100%, man. And that's one thing you see across all sports is the people who are doing really well in their sport, typically, they train a lot. And at the very least, yes, I agree with the counterfactual that we can't know what they would have been like if they trained maybe less. at the very least, it's not preventing them from being the best at their sport. So it's not playing a huge detrimental role.
Exactly. It's like, you know, maybe 50 sets is optimal, but you know, 100 sets is working just fine. So it's we know it's good enough.
100%.
On the topic of training volume, I know you mentioned proximity to failure. So this will influence your training volume, and you kind of can't look at either of those in isolation. What's the optimal number of sets per week? It will change very much based on whether you're pushing those to absolute failure or you're leaving some reps in reserve and they're therefore less fatiguing. And I know you talked a little bit about, on a set per set basis, training to failure does lead to greater hypertrophy than leaving a couple of reps in reserve. And in your videos, you talk about the point of non-linearity. One thing I want to know is, do you think one of these is more important when it comes to hypertrophy, volume, or training to failure? Or do you think you could have kind of equal results doing more volume and leaving some reps in reserve, or less volume and pushing every set to failure? Where would you go with those options?
That's a really interesting question. And that's a question I've been asking myself for like half a year now. So, hey, we're on the same page. There is actually some data coming out relatively soon to try and answer this that I'm aware of behind the scenes. So hopefully at some point we'll have a better answer. But for now, here's my best guess. The best way to look at it is probably, and this isn't perfectly valid, to look at what sort of improvements you see, say going from 3 reps in reserve to failure versus say going from 10 sets a week to 15 sets a week. And then keeping in mind that both of these decisions have a fatigue cost. Doing more volume is going to be causing more fatigue. Going closer to failure is going to be causing more fatigue. And we kind of need to weigh up how much more growth do we get from doing more volume versus how much extra fatigue do we get, and the same for going closer to failure, and compare the two and see where the trade-off is better. For the time being, I think you actually see a relatively similar trade-off. So I think that you could either do slightly lower volume and go all the way to failure on every set, for example, for hypertrophy. Now, you could also do more volume and simply be a bit more submaximal. My hunch is that obviously you don't want to take sets 5 or more reps shy of failure typically. I think that's counter-advised for hypertrophy. Likewise, I don't think nearly anyone will see their best hypertrophy doing fewer than 10 sets a week, right? I think that's super unlikely at this stage. You will have the outliers, right? Like I think maybe a few in 1,000 might see better hypertrophy that way. But I think the vast majority of people will be best off doing at least 10 or 15 sets a week per muscle group, training pretty close to failure. But then when it comes to optimizing stimulus, you kind of have a choice of, do I just want to push the volume component and keep intensity high, but not maximal, not taking every set to failure? Or do I want to keep more volume a little bit more moderate, but push every set really close to failure or to failure? I think the answer to that question is relatively individual. I think that if, for example, you're more pressed for time, you're better off keeping volume a bit lower, but pushing every set to failure, because there's essentially no additional time cost of pushing every set to failure. And so if you're someone who's busy lifestyle, you can only train 2 hours a week, for example, absolutely make the most use of every set you possibly could. Take it to failure, maybe even beyond failure, to get as much hypertrophy from that one set or from those few precious sets a week that you possibly can. Conversely, if you're someone who's also interested in strength potentially, right? Like you still want to develop your strength. If you look at the data on strength development and how close to failure you should train, it seems that actually training a bit more submaximally offers basically the same benefits as training to failure. So maybe if you're someone who's interested in strength, or someone who finds you get super fatigued from training to failure, maybe you'd rather train with slightly higher volumes, but keep a little bit farther from failure. As far as the fatigue research goes, go for it.
Just to clarify on that point, when you say submaximally, I just want to point out that means with regards to reps in reserve, not with regards to intent or effort.
Oh, 100%. It should still be pretty high effort, but it just means you're not actually failing any reps. You should still have a couple reps on the tank, right? With regards to fatigue, it seems like both doing more volume and training closer to failure is more fatiguing. It's unclear to what extent training to failure is something you can get used to, right? We have little to no research looking at, okay, well, the first time you train a failure, when you put these people in the lab and have them train a failure, it definitely is more fatiguing than not training to failure. But one very well-established thing within the human body, as far as training responses go, is that as you get exposed to the same stimulus over and over again, to the same source of fatigue, your body kind of gets better at resisting that fatigue. It becomes more fatigue resistant. And that likely applies to training to failure too. So my hunch is that if a lot of these studies on the fatigue stemming from training to failure were repeated after these participants trained to failure for, say, 6 weeks, 12 weeks, there's a good chance that there would be still an effect of training to failure on fatigue, such that when you push harder, you get more tired. But I would say the difference might be relatively smaller. And so, generally speaking, I think you can either push volume a little bit harder or you can push intensity a little bit harder, but both should be pushed relatively hard if you're really trying to get your maximum growth.
Super insightful. What about the idea of adding volume as progressive overload? So I think most people are aware of progressive overload with regards to adding reps, adding load, more challenging progressions of an exercise in calisthenics. But a few people like to add sets, and in the kind of evidence-based community, seems to be a little bit contentious. Do you have any thoughts of, doing 3 sets per week of this exercise week 1, and then week 2 doing 4 sets and so forth?
My hunch is that there's not much that's inherently beneficial about adding volume week to week, and that it mostly comes down to, on average, across your whole block, what's your volume like? Maybe you start at 10 sets and end at 20 sets, but your average was 15 sets. And maybe compared to a group that just stayed at 15 sets, you could have seen the same growth, right? Now, we have a few studies looking at either increasing or decreasing volume relative to your baseline. And I'm sad to say that by and large, it's not super consistent yet. I couldn't tell you that adding volume week to week really was the key to more growth. As I said, it seems like the dose of resistance training over time is the main thing, not exactly how you change that dose or titrate it over time. It's mostly about just train pretty hard over time, pretty consistently over years and years, and that's what's going to lead to more growth. And the reason why most people progressively overload by adding weight and or reps week to week is so that they can stay at the same intensity or the same proximity to failure. But adding sets week to week, that's kind of a different thing altogether, because then you're talking about doing more training versus like just keeping intensity pretty high. And I think that compared to just keeping the same productive volume every week, there's likely no need for adding volume week to week if your main goal is hypertrophy. If you're looking to increase work capacity or something else, maybe there's a point there. But for hypertrophy purely, I can't say the evidence supports it for now.
Yeah, I think our intuitions align on that. It's like if let's say theoretically 20 sets per week is your optimal training volume, why would you start at 10 and progress? Why not spend all your time at that point? And you can kind of titrate that volume based on response. I feel great. I feel like I can handle a lot more. I'm motivated to do more. Great, push it up. But why not progressively overload with the other options available? Another thing with that is you're potentially adding a lot of training stress by adding sets.
100%. I think it makes training a bit more convoluted as well, because then you go to the gym and you're like, oh, or you go to your calisthenics park and you're like, oh, what am I doing today? Oh, it's twice as long as last session. I wasn't prepared for this. Doesn't fit into your schedule as easily.
Yeah. I think it just adds training. I think a lot of the stuff online is just adding training complexity for the sake of it, rather than with a good reason.
100%, man. It's I think a certain camp of people generally are attracted to more complexity is better, and it's simply not true.
Yeah, I think that's something that was attractive about the volume load concept of sets times reps times weight plus or minus adding in the range of motion, because it's nice, it's mathematical, it seems scientific. You get this kind of hard numerical answer where you're like, this is higher, it's therefore better, but it doesn't play out in practice. On that note, one thing I think a lot of people have this erroneous intuition about is the concept of the EMG study showed greater amplitude in this exercise. And this is big in physical therapy as well. It's, this exercise showed greater EMG amplitude of this rotator cuff muscle. It's therefore better. Can you give your 2 cents on that and tell me why this is wrong?
Absolutely. So there's a few things here. First, EMG measures electrical activity within a muscle. This is not even perfectly linked to recruitment of motor units. Much less is that then predictive of how muscle will grow over weeks and weeks and weeks, right? There's a lot of, with any measurement method, whether we're talking about ultrasound, we're talking about MRI, we're talking about EMG in this case, there are a lot of conditions that need to be met for the measurement to even be valid and reliable to begin with. Then there's further assumptions baked into how that then predicts hypertrophy. As I mentioned, from whether or not even measures recruitment to begin with is complicated. Basically, I think the most straightforward way to examine this question is to actually look at studies that have measured EMG and then also measured hypertrophy from those exercises. The most recent study on this topic was by Plotkin and colleagues, where essentially they had participants perform the exact same program, but one group did only squats and one group did only hip thrusts. Now, before they did their about, I believe, 10 weeks of training, they had participants hooked up to the EMG system, their electrodes on their glutes, on their quads, on their adductors, on their hamstrings, and they measured EMG in those muscle groups. And then, after they ran their training program and measured their hypertrophy before and after, and saw how much each muscle group grew from squatting versus hip thrusting, they tried to see whether or not the EMG readings that they got before the study in the glutes, adductors, quads, hamstrings would actually correlate with what sort of growth you saw. Long story short, it didn't at all. There was essentially no correlation between hypertrophy of different muscle groups and the EMG that they measured at baseline. So, for example, they saw relatively meaningfully higher EMG activation, in the glutes in the hip thrust. And so, if you think EMG predicts hypertrophy, you would say, well, the hip thrust must be a better glute exercise than the squat. And in the end, the squat and the hip thrust grew the glutes just the same. So even though you saw higher EMG in the glutes and hip thrust, that didn't predict hypertrophy at all. The same was true for pretty much all muscle groups. And even better than that, within muscle groups. So they placed EMG electrodes on different areas of each muscle group. And even within each muscle group, EMG, for example, in the upper glute versus the lower glute, also didn't predict hypertrophy. So both between muscle groups and within muscle groups, it still didn't predict hypertrophy. And so when you have these theoretical concerns about how EMG will predict hypertrophy, and then you have actual data backing that up, that it doesn't seem to predict hypertrophy, but then you still see so many influencers using EMG as a means to compare exercises. It's a bit scary. And I think some people have now stopped doing it, and it's very good. But a lot of people, it's just appealing, right? On the same note as you mentioned, volume load, just seeing those spikes in that trend line of the graph, and you're like, ooh, high peak EMG, that's gotta be good for hypertrophy, you know? It just turns out that's not true. And the same to an extent applies for the feel you get during an exercise. Don't get me wrong, if you don't feel anything, that's not great, right? But then a lot of people don't really feel their glutes in, for example, the squat that much. But yet, if you look at hypertrophy, with deep squat especially, the glutes grow just fine. Likewise, during the hip thrust, many people report feeling their hamstrings. But if you actually look at the growth you get in the hamstrings, they don't grow. So both EMG and sort of perception of, ooh, I feel this in my elbows or whatever, doesn't mean that your elbows are growing, for example. It's a feeling. It doesn't mean that there is going to be growth if you repeat that exercise. So EMG is definitely not the main principle by which to assess, or the main data by which to assess different exercises, different techniques, or anything of that sort.
Yeah, it's great when you have this, theoretical argument for why you shouldn't use it as a proxy for strength gains or muscle growth, but then you have this kind of real world example of squats versus hip thrusts, different EMG values, similar muscle growth. And I think this applies to things like people talking about the significance of the VMO, and can you even isolate the VMO? And everybody refers to EMG studies. And I'm thinking, well, these findings are inconsistent anyway, but even if they were, you can't make assumptions based on this and relate that to hypertrophy or strength, or, specifically targeting a muscle. Another good example on the topic of calisthenics is there's a study looking at pull-ups that compared EMG amplitudes of, I think, the abs and the shoulder extensors, and people saw this study and went, oh, higher ab activity with the pull-up. The pull-up is an ab exercise. And sure, the pull-up might give you some stimulus for ab strength and ab hypertrophy, but it's not an ab exercise. I don't think anyone fails pull-ups because their abs are too weak. And different muscles will conduct better and give you higher EMG amplitudes anyway. Different contractions types, concentric, eccentric, isometric, different muscle lengths will change. So at longer muscle lengths, you might get less EMG, but greater total tension. So yeah, plenty of reasons why you can't just look at EMG and say this is why an exercise is better or worse.
100%. And as a fun aside note, about a month before I started my undergraduate degree in sports science, I remember reading Brett Contreras' articles on T Nation about EMG, and I actually went and based my entire exercise selection pretty much off of those EMG readings. And so I was doing hip thrusts for my quads. And needless to say, I didn't see much quad growth in those few months. So
Yeah, and
don't buy into the EMG stuff.
yeah, I think if you go off feeling and off EMG, you would often just go for very shortened positions. Like if I want to feel my bicep, I feel my bicep here a lot more than I do in an extended position, and I feel hip thrusts more than squats in my glutes. And as you mentioned earlier, it's kind of the opposite that you want if you want to maximize hypertrophy. You probably want to be challenging muscles at length where oftentimes you don't feel them as much.
Yep. And that goes right hand in hand with the overemphasis over the decades, I think by bodybuilders especially, on the peak contraction, the squeeze, you know.
Yeah.
It's just because it feels nice. And that's cool and all, but I'm not going to the gym. Well, I am actually. I'm going to the gym to feel nice, but I think I can feel nice just by exercising in general, and I'd rather get more hypertrophy than less.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I think there are a lot of parallels between like feeling a muscle working and pain science. Like pain does not always represent damage. You know, you can often get a paper cut that hurts a lot more than a break or a much more significant injury. And it's the same deal. It's kind of like a sense of humor. Just because you find something funny doesn't mean it is, and just because you find something not funny doesn't mean it's not. It's going to be different things that trigger different people. And same deal with feeling a muscle. So I tend to not. I like to keep things simple and tend to not worry about that, and just worry about progressively overloading.
Pain science is another rabbit hole.
Yeah.
A lot that could be said there.
The last topic I want to discuss is just machine versus free weights. A lot of people have kind of shamed machines for a long time and said free weights are more functional. When it comes to muscle growth, are machines or free weights better? And when it comes to strength gains, are machines or free weights better?
Sure, let's do it. There's actually been, I think, like 3 systematic reviews of meta-analyses lately, so that means there's enough data to compare this pretty effectively. Basically, for hypertrophy, there are no differences. Um, Given that you're performing the same movement pattern, and obviously some machines are going to be slightly better than other machines, and sometimes one free weight movement might have advantages over a machine or vice versa. But by and large, on principle, machines are not better for hypertrophy than free weights, and free weights are not better for hypertrophy than machines. They're simply different tools that, on principle, have the same usefulness for muscle growth. So I think that generally you're best off combining the two in some regard. There'll be movements, if you have access to a gym, that are typically better performed on a machine, right? Like, for example, if you want to really isolate your rear delts, let's say, right? You're a freak. You care about your rear delts a lot. Doing a bent over dumbbell fly, you simply won't get much of a stretch on rear delts because there is no tension at the bottom. And even you can't even get a really good stretch as far as the position goes. Ideally, you'd want your arms crossed over your body, kind of like the top of a cable crossover, so you get deep stretch in your delts. With dumbbells, you can't even do that. Whereas with cables, for example, aka a machine, you can get a deep stretch and you can actually make that position challenging. So for certain movement patterns, cables are better. However, the opposite is true for other things. For example, if you want to isolate your chest, dumbbells might actually be a better option than cables. Because with dumbbells, if you do a dumbbell fly, that is essentially targeting your chest in the most lengthened position, with the resistance curve being most difficult at the very bottom. Whereas with cables, you can't really modify the resistance curve that easily typically. And so it turns out free weights and machines, even though they offer the same hypertrophy benefits, which is counter to what many people believe, they have advantages in certain situations. So be open to using both. For strength, it seems like, once again, kind of like with range of motion, performance adaptations are specific. So if you want to get better at machine-based work, you should probably do mostly machine-based work. If you want to get better at free weight movements, like pretty much every calisthenics athletes ever, you should mostly do free weight movements, right? You can still do some machine work, for example, if you want to focus on hypertrophy or something like that, but just be aware that it will transfer less effectively than if you just did a free weight movement instead.
That's great. And this brings me to a final question. I'll just give my kind of thoughts on it, and then I'd love to get yours. One question I'm often asked is, what's the best accessory exercise for skill X. So for example, I want to learn the handstand push-up. Is the landmine press better? A dumbbell press is better? Is the barbell overhead press better? And my general response to every variant of this question, whether it's related to the planche, the front lever, the handstand push-up, is it doesn't really matter as long as it's kind of a similar exercise. So as long as you're doing your specific skill work, you're training the handstand push-up itself with your handstand push-up progressions and getting sufficient volume, by the time you get to your accessories, whether you're doing machines, free weights, landmine press, dumbbell press, overhead press, most of the benefits from that are going to come from accruing more muscle mass in the relevant tissues for the skill. And as we found with these machine versus free weight studies, it doesn't really matter what you do when it's tested on a naive exercise or it's tested with an isometric strength test. And two, given that these are kind of at the end of your session, you've already got your volume in with the specific lifts, the additional benefit of this extra volume and these accessories is so small that it probably doesn't matter.
I agree. I think you're right on the money. I think that as long as you're getting 25 to say 50% or more, depending on how focused on this movement you are, of your work in via what's the most specific exercise you could possibly do, right? So if you can already do a handstand push-up, do handstand push-ups. If you can't do that, maybe you can just do eccentrics or something, right? Or maybe you can find a really similar, like sort of maybe I don't know what you call them, like a pike push-up. Yeah, there you go. Like something as close as possible to a handstand push-up, right? And then for the remainder of your work, you will see diminishing returns to being specific, right? So if you're already doing half of your training with handstand push-ups, how much of an extra benefit are you really going to get from doing the rest of your training as handstand push-ups as well? If anything, as you mentioned, in the long term, muscle mass really plays a key role. So picking exercises that are best suited towards hypertrophy while still being reasonably specific, right? Don't go out and start doing dumbbell kickbacks for your overhead push-up, right? But by and large, the rest of your work can be more hypertrophy focused and you will get all the benefits that you could possibly get.
Yeah, even when I think about, just to give an example that seems kind of ridiculous, but I don't think there would be a big difference. If you took the handstand push-up, for example, or even just the overhead press, and you're doing plenty of specific exercises. So you're doing your handstand push-up variations, weighted handstand push-ups, full range handstand push-ups, floor handstand push-ups, or for the overhead press, barbell overhead press, Smith machine overhead press, and dumbbell overhead press is your kind of specific exercises. And then you say, which accessory is going to give me the best bang for my buck? Should I do a machine overhead exercise or should I do dips? And if I was just to compare the two accessories with no other context, I'd probably say do the overhead exercise. It's more specific. But given that you've already done so much specific work, I think in this case, dips may even perform better just because they add some variety. You'll be challenging kind of different muscle fibers. They're challenging muscles at a different length. It might be less stressful on the same parts of your connective tissue and allow for kind of dissipation of stress and less risk of overuse injury. So I think even at that level, it doesn't really matter when it comes to your accessories. Just do your specifics and train hard and the results will add up over time.
Simon, I agree 100%. And I think that whenever you talk about specificity as well, keep in mind, you're not typically just training for one movement. In all likelihood, you also want to get better at some sort of push-up exercise or some sort of like dip exercise. And so you can also be relatively specific one movement and have other movements in your arsenal that you're training towards. You don't need to be ultra specific for each movement.
Yep, that's yeah, I fully agree. I don't think anyone's out there like I just want the handstand push-up and I don't care about anything else. I'm aware I've taken already 70 minutes of your time, so I just want to say thanks so much. This has been super insightful. And I assume you don't do a lot of calisthenics. It's mostly lifting. Is that correct?
No, I mean, I do dips, I do push-ups, I do pull-ups, chin-ups, but that's about it. If I was strong enough to do handstand push-ups, I would consider them. But unfortunately, like I'm not sure how easy it is. Like I think it's quite challenging from what I can tell.
Yeah, you're a pretty big guy as well, aren't you?
Yeah, I can I'm big. Yeah, like I weigh right now like 240.
Yeah, so, okay, yeah. That's
it's gonna be challenging. But I can overpress like 225, 230.
You can handstand push up.
Maybe. Anyways, but yeah, so maybe at some point I'll get more into it when I'm cutting down right now. So maybe at the end of my cut.
Yeah, cool. But it just goes to show that the underlying principles of building strength and building muscle mass are the same, whether you're using your body weight or using weights. And for a lot of the calisthenics questions that I have, you know, you and Greg and you'd be the guys that I'd go to ask questions. So it just goes to show you don't need a calisthenics specialist to be a great coach. The kind of principles of building strength are the same across powerlifting, general lifting, calisthenics, whatever your strength sport is.
100% agree, man.
Can you let people know where to find you if you're looking for coaching? I strongly recommend checking out Milo.
Hey, thank you, man. So you can find me on YouTube at Wolf Coaching. I've been putting out a lot of information, trying to put out 2 videos every week. So that's the main place I'm active nowadays. You can find me on Instagram at Wolf Coach. That's my last name and coach. And finally, for coaching related stuff, you can find that at wolfcoaching.com. And my research, if you just type in Milo Wolf ResearchGate, you'll find all the stuff on range of motion, plus some other topics like training to failure. How accurate are we at that sort of stuff.
Awesome. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you for having me, Simon. It was great.